Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we unseal another forgotten volume of mystery from its shadowed shelves, where a single diary reveals secrets 15 years in the making. What begins as ink on a page will end in betrayal, poison, and justice. If you enjoy mysteries like this, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps the lamps glowing within the Hidden Library. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from. Your comments keep me motivated. Now, settle in by the fire, let the village fog roll in, and join Miss Marple as she unravels the secret diary of Rose Linton. The Secret Diary of Rose Linton. Chapter 1. A Quiet Corner by the Sea. The morning train from London wheezed to a halt at Marbury station with the gentle sigh of an elderly lady settling into her favourite armchair. Miss Jane Marple gathered her knitting bag and modest travelling case, stepping onto the platform with the careful precision of one who had learned that haste, at her time of life, was rarely profitable. The sea air carried the mingled scents of salt and honeysuckle, a combination that immediately transported her back to childhood holidays spent with her dear friend Dorothy Weatherby, then Dorothy Hartwell, before marriage had changed her name, but not, Miss Marple hoped, her character. It had been far too many years since they had seen each other properly, and the invitation to spend a fortnight in this quiet coastal village had come at precisely the right moment. "Jane! My dear Jane!" Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby approached with arms outstretched, her grey hair neatly waved, and her blue eyes bright with genuine pleasure. She had grown stouter with the years, as most comfortable widows do, but retained the warm smile that had made her such a favourite at school. "Dorothy, you look wonderfully well," Miss Marple said, embracing her old friend. "And what a charming station! So much more civilized than those dreadful London termini." "Oh, we're frightfully proud of our little corner of the world," Mrs. Weatherby replied, taking Miss Marple's arm as they walked toward a neat Morris Minor. "You'll find Marbury hasn't changed much since the war. Rather set in its ways, one might say, but pleasantly so." The drive through the village revealed exactly what Miss Marple had expected. A collection of stone cottages with well-tended gardens, a Norman church whose bells were just striking 11, and the inevitable cluster of shops surrounding a small market square. What she hadn't expected was the subtle undercurrent of watchfulness she noticed as they passed. Curtains twitched at windows, and more than one villager paused in their morning activities to observe the stranger in Mrs. Weatherby's motor car. "Everyone's rather curious about newcomers," Dorothy explained, following Miss Marple's glance toward a woman who had stopped sweeping her doorstep to stare. "We don't get many visitors outside of the summer season." They passed a particularly impressive house set back from the road behind iron gates, its gardens immaculate despite the October chill. A woman in an expensive wool coat was directing a gardener with imperious gestures. "That's Mrs. Eleanor Selby," Dorothy said, lowering her voice slightly. "Our local grande dame. Lost her husband during the war. Pneumonia, poor man. But she's carried on admirably. Very generous to village causes, though she does rather like things done her way." Miss Marple observed Mrs. Selby's commanding posture and the gardener's deferential response to her instructions. "She appears to be a woman of strong character." "Oh, indeed. Rather like having royalty in residence, at times." They turned into a narrow lane lined with cottage gardens where the last roses of autumn bloomed against whitewashed walls. Dorothy's home proved to be a delightful example of coastal vernacular, grey stone softened by climbing ivy, windows that caught the morning light, and the sort of garden that spoke of decades of patient cultivation. Over tea served in the sitting room, proper tea with thin sandwiches and seed cake, Dorothy provided the sort of comprehensive village report that Miss Marple always found invaluable. Our vicar is Mr. Thornfield, rather young for the position but earnest enough. Came to us just after the war when old Canon Pembroke retired. Scholarly type, always buried in his theological books. Never married, which some of the ladies consider quite a waste." Miss Marple made appropriately encouraging sounds while noting the slight hesitation in Dorothy's voice when she mentioned the vicar's unmarried state. "Then there's our librarian, Rose Linton. Quiet little thing, keeps very much to herself. Lives in Ivy Cottage, just past the church. Been here, 15 years at least. Came down from London after some family trouble. Never speaks of it, mind you, but one gathers there were difficulties." "A librarian," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "How useful for a village to have someone who appreciates books and learning." "Oh yes, Rose is frightfully well read. Sometimes I think she knows more about Marbury's history than those of us who were born here. Always poking about in the parish records and old newspapers. Harmless enough hobby, I suppose." Through the sitting-room window, Miss Marple could see the village street and the comings and goings of afternoon life. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair walked past with measured steps, nodding politely to passers-by. "That's Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell," Dorothy said, following her gaze. "Retired solicitor. No relation to my late husband, though they shared a surname. Lives quite alone since his wife died 3 years ago. Takes long walks along the cliffs. Says the sea air helps his digestion." Miss Marple watched Mr. Hartwell's progress down the street, noting the way other villagers acknowledged him with what seemed like respectful wariness rather than genuine warmth. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Dorothy suggested a walk to show off the village properly. They strolled past the post office, where Mrs. Selby was engaged in what appeared to be an animated discussion with the postmaster about postal regulations, and the baker's shop, where the warm scent of fresh bread mingled with village gossip. At the heart of the village stood the lending library, housed in a converted cottage with diamond-paned windows and a painted sign that read, "Marbury Public Library, Miss R. Linton, Librarian." Through the window, Miss Marple glimpsed a slight figure moving between the shelves with economical precision. "Rose keeps excellent hours," Dorothy observed. "Open every day except Sunday, and always stays late if someone needs a particular book. Rather dedicated to her work, one might say." Miss Marple studied the library's neat exterior and noted how strategically positioned it was, commanding a view of both the church and the main street. An ideal spot for someone who preferred to observe rather than participate. The woman inside seemed to sense their regard, for she looked up from her work and moved to the window. Miss Marple caught a brief glimpse of an intelligent face, neither young nor old, framed by brown hair touched with grey. Rose Linton's eyes met hers for just a moment before the librarian stepped back into the shadows between her shelves. Something in that brief exchange made Miss Marple pause. There had been recognition there, not of her personally, but of a kindred spirit. Another woman who understood the value of patient observation and careful attention to detail. "She seems a most capable person," Miss Marple said quietly. As they walked home in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself looking forward to making Miss Rose Linton's acquaintance properly. In her experience, librarians often possessed the most interesting perspectives on human nature, having the opportunity to observe people's choices in reading material and their behavior in quiet spaces. The evening settled over Marbury with the peaceful hush of a village, confident in its routines. But Miss Marple couldn't quite shake the feeling that beneath this tranquil surface, currents of tension ran deeper than appeared at first glance. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Library. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of autumn light that seems to illuminate every detail with unusual sharpness. Miss Marple, after a restful night in Dorothy's comfortable spare room, announced her intention to explore the village more thoroughly. I thought I might visit the library, she said over breakfast. One can learn so much about a place from its books, and I find librarians are often the most knowledgeable people in any community. Dorothy buttered her toast with careful precision. Oh, Rose will be delighted to have a visitor. She doesn't get many callers, I'm afraid. Rather keeps to herself, as I mentioned. Miss Marple made her way through the village, noting the subtle signs of morning routine. Milk bottles collected from doorsteps, shopkeepers arranging their displays, and the general air of purposeful activity that marked the beginning of another day in Marbury's orderly existence. The library door bore a small brass bell that chimed softly as she entered. The interior proved to be larger than it appeared from outside, with tall shelves arranged to create intimate reading nooks and a large desk positioned near the front window. The air held the distinctive scent of well-cared-for books and furniture polish. "Good morning," came a quiet voice from behind the circulation desk. "May I help you?" Rose Linton emerged from the shadows, and Miss Marple had her first proper look at the village librarian. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a face that suggested both gentleness and determination. Her dress was neat but unremarkable, the sort chosen by someone who preferred not to attract attention. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "I'm Jane Marple, staying with Mrs. Weatherby for a fortnight. I wondered if you might recommend something suitable for holiday reading." "Of course, Miss Marple. Dorothy mentioned you might visit." Rose's smile was genuine but reserved. "What sort of books do you usually enjoy?" "Oh, I'm not at all particular. Detective novels, perhaps, or biography. I find real life quite as interesting as fiction, don't you?" Something flickered in Rose's eyes at this observation. "Indeed, sometimes I think real life is far more complex than any novelist would dare invent." As Rose led her toward the fiction shelves, Miss Marple noticed the librarian's careful organization and the detailed card system she maintained. More interesting still were the notebooks scattered about the desk, filled with neat handwriting that appeared to go well beyond simple library records. "You keep very thorough notes," Miss Marple observed gently. "Old habits," Rose replied, but her tone was guarded. "I find that details often prove important later, even when they seem insignificant at the time." They were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Thornfield, a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and nervous hands that seemed constantly in motion. He nodded politely to Miss Marple before approaching the desk with obvious purpose. "Miss Linton, I wonder if you might have received those ecclesiastical histories I requested from the county library." "Not yet, Mr. Thornfield," Rose replied, consulting her records. "The request was rather specific. Historical records of disputed baptisms in coastal parishes during the 18th century, wasn't it?" The vicar's hands fidgeted with his clerical collar. "Research for a sermon series, the historical context of pastoral responsibilities, you understand." Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis Rose placed on certain words and the way the vicar avoided her eyes when explaining his request. After he departed with hurried thanks, Rose turned back to her visitor with what might have been amusement. "Mr. Thornfield is very dedicated to his scholarly pursuits," she said carefully, "though sometimes I wonder if the past doesn't trouble him more than it should." Before Miss Marple could respond, the library door chimed again, admitting Mrs. Selby in a rustle of expensive silk. The widow swept towards the desk with the air of one accustomed to immediate attention. "Miss Linton, I've come to return these volumes," she announced, placing 3 books on the counter with barely concealed irritation. "I must say the binding on this biography is quite deteriorated. Really, the library should maintain higher standards." Rose examined the returned books with professional calm. I'm sorry the condition disappointed you, Mrs. Selby. These volumes are rather old, but they contain valuable information not available elsewhere. Information, Mrs. Selby repeated with a slight sniff. Yes, well, I suppose some people find value in dwelling on the past. Personally, I believe in looking forward rather than backward. Her gaze swept over Miss Marple with cool assessment before she continued. I trust you'll be more careful about recommendations in future, Miss Linton. Not everyone appreciates having their time wasted. After Mrs. Selby's imperious departure, Rose stood for a moment in thoughtful silence, then moved to reshelve the returned books with particular care. Mrs. Selby has very definite opinions, Miss Marple observed mildly. She does indeed. Rose's voice carried undertones that suggested volumes left unsaid. Though sometimes I think people protest too loudly when they wish to avoid uncomfortable truths. The morning continued with a steady stream of borrowers, each interaction revealing something of village dynamics. Miss Marple noticed how Rose seemed to catalogue not just which books people requested, but their reactions to various subjects and their general demeanour. It was the behaviour of someone naturally observant, or perhaps someone who had learned the importance of watching and listening. When the library emptied during this lunch hour, Rose showed Miss Marple to a comfortable reading corner near the local history section. As they discussed books and village life, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the librarian's careful way of speaking. Always accurate, but somehow guarded. You must know a great deal about Marbury's history, Miss Marple ventured, working with all these records and older residents. Rose's hand stilled on the book she was holding. One does hear things, of course. Villagers have long memories, and people sometimes confide in their librarian as they might in a priest or doctor. How wise of them to choose someone so discreet. Discretion is essential, Rose agreed, but there was something in her tone that suggested the burden of keeping secrets weighed heavily upon her. Though sometimes one wonders whether discretion and silence are quite the same thing. The afternoon brought a young woman with London clothes and an anxious expression, who hurried to the desk with obvious agitation. Aunt Rose, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I wondered if we might speak this evening. There are some family matters. Rose's face softened with genuine warmth. Of course, Clara dear, come for tea around 6. Miss Marple, may I present my niece, Miss Clara Hartwell. Clara, this is Miss Marple, who's staying with Dorothy Weatherby. Clara Hartwell managed a polite greeting, but Miss Marple noted the underlying tension in her manner and the way her eyes darted nervously about the library, as if she feared being overheard. As the day drew to a close and Miss Marple prepared to leave, she found herself studying Rose Linton with growing interest. Here was a woman who clearly saw much and said little, who moved through her daily routines with careful precision while harbouring thoughts that went far deeper than her simple position might suggest. Thank you for a most enlightening visit, Miss Marple said, accepting the mystery novel Rose had recommended. I look forward to returning tomorrow. Rose's smile seemed genuinely pleased. I should enjoy that very much. It's rare to meet someone who understands the value of patient observation. Walking back to Dorothy's cottage in the gathering twilight, Miss Marple reflected on the day's encounters. Rose Linton was undoubtedly more than she appeared, a woman who collected information with the same care she catalogued books. The question that lingered in Miss Marple's mind was whether the librarian's careful watchfulness stemmed from natural curiosity or from something far more serious. Chapter 3. Shadows and Secrets. The third day of Miss Marple's visit brought with it a peculiar atmosphere of unrest that seemed to permeate the usually tranquil village of Marbury. Even Dorothy noticed it over their morning tea, remarking with uncharacteristic concern that the postman had delivered several official-looking letters to various houses, and that Mrs. Pemberton at the baker's had seemed quite distracted when measuring out her usual order of currant buns. "There's to be a meeting this afternoon about the autumn fete," Dorothy announced, consulting the parish newsletter. "The final planning session before the actual event. I do hope you won't find it frightfully dull, but it's rather the social event of the season, and everyone will be there." Miss Marple assured her hostess that village gatherings were among her favourite entertainments, and indeed, as they made their way to the parish hall that afternoon, she found herself looking forward to observing the community dynamics in a more formal setting. The parish hall was a solid Victorian structure that served multiple purposes, from wedding receptions to amateur theatrical performances. This afternoon, it buzzed with the controlled chaos of committee work as various subgroups discussed stall arrangements, volunteer schedules, and the eternal question of whether the tombola should be positioned near the entrance or the tea tent. Mrs. Selby commanded the proceedings from the front of the hall, her voice carrying easily over the general murmur of conversation. She had appointed herself chairman of the organizing committee several years earlier, a position she filled with military precision and unwavering confidence in her own judgment. "Now then," she announced, consulting a leather-bound notebook, "we must finalize the financial arrangements. The church roof fund requires a minimum of £50 from our proceeds, and I've calculated that with proper organization we should easily exceed that target." Reverend Thornfield, seated near the back of the hall, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mrs. Selby, I'm most grateful for your efforts, but perhaps we shouldn't count our chickens before they're hatched. Weather can be so unpredictable at this time of year." "Nonsense, Mr. Thornfield. With proper planning, we can overcome any reasonable obstacles." Mrs. Selby's tone suggested that even the weather would not dare to contradict her arrangements. Miss Marple noted the way other committee members exchanged glances when Mrs. Selby spoke. There was respect there, certainly, but also a kind of wary deference that suggested her authority was not entirely welcome to everyone present. From her position near the tea-urn, Rose Linton observed the proceedings with quiet attention, occasionally making notes in a small journal she carried. When asked about the bookstall arrangements, she responded with her usual precision, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension in her manner that hadn't been present during their library conversation. "Miss Linton has kindly agreed to manage the second-hand bookstall," Mrs. Selby announced. "Though I do hope we'll have more appealing titles than last year. Some of those volumes were positively ancient." "Old books often contain the most interesting information," Rose replied evenly. "Historical records, family chronicles, personal memoirs. Sometimes the past proves quite illuminating for those who take the time to examine it properly." An uncomfortable silence followed this observation. Miss Marple watched as several faces around the room registered what seemed like unease at Rose's words. Mrs. Selby's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, while Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, suddenly became very interested in his notebook. The tension was broken by Clara Hartwell's arrival, slightly breathless and apologetic for her lateness. She took a seat near her aunt, but Miss Marple observed that her presence seemed to add to, rather than alleviate, Rose's apparent anxiety. As the meeting progressed through various administrative details, Miss Marple found herself studying the subtle interplay of relationships within the group. There were the obvious dynamics, Mrs. Selby's dominance, the vicar's nervous deference, the general committee's reluctant cooperation. But beneath these surface tensions, she sensed something deeper and more troubling. When the discussion turned to publicity for the event, Mr. Hartwell finally spoke up. "I've prepared a brief historical notice for the county newspaper," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Nothing elaborate, just a mention of the church's heritage and the community's charitable efforts." "How thoughtful," Mrs. Selby replied, though her tone suggested she found his contribution unnecessary. though I trust you've kept the historical details appropriate. Some aspects of local history are perhaps better left undisturbed." The retired solicitor's face flushed slightly. "I'm quite capable of exercising proper discretion, Mrs. Selby. My professional training included a thorough understanding of confidentiality." "Of course it did," she replied smoothly, "though wartime conditions sometimes required flexibility in such matters." Miss Marple watched this exchange with growing interest. The words seemed innocent enough, but the undercurrents were unmistakable. Both speakers were referring to something specific, something that neither wished to address directly in present company. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple lingered as the hall slowly emptied, helping Dorothy stack chairs and observing the way people grouped themselves for departure. She noticed that Rose and Clara left together in earnest conversation, their heads bent close as they walked toward Ivy Cottage. Mrs. Selby departed alone in her motor car, but not before engaging in a brief, sharp exchange with Mr. Hartwell near the doorway. "Quite a productive meeting," Dorothy commented as they walked home through the deepening autumn twilight. "Though I did think the atmosphere seemed a bit strained. Perhaps it's just the usual pre-event nerves." Miss Marple murmured appropriate agreement, but privately she doubted that ordinary organizational stress could account for the tensions she had witnessed. There had been something almost theatrical about certain exchanges, as if the participants were playing roles in a drama whose full script remained hidden from the audience. That evening, as she sat in Dorothy's comfortable sitting room working on her knitting, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the day's observations. Rose Linton's careful comments about the past proving illuminating, Mrs. Selby's pointed references to wartime flexibility, Mr. Hartwell's defensive response to questions about discretion, all suggested that Marbury's peaceful surface concealed complications that its residents preferred to keep buried. Through the window, she could see the lights of various cottages scattered throughout the village, each representing a household going through its evening routine. But one light in particular caught her attention. The bright glow from Rose Linton's study window, where a figure moved back and forth with restless energy, occasionally pausing at the desk as if writing or consulting documents. It was past 11 o'clock when that light finally went out, much later than seemed typical for a village librarian's evening routine. Miss Marple made a mental note of the detail, adding it to the growing collection of small observations that, in her experience, often proved significant when viewed as part of a larger pattern. The night settled over Marbury with deceptive tranquility, but Miss Marple's instincts, sharpened by years of observing human nature, told her that beneath the village's orderly surface, forces were stirring that would soon disturb the peace in ways that no one yet anticipated. Chapter 4. The Spilled Ink. The scream that shattered the morning quiet of Marbury came from the direction of Ivy Cottage, piercing the autumn air like a knife through silk. Miss Marple, who had been enjoying a peaceful breakfast in Dorothy's garden, immediately set down her teacup and rose to her feet with the swift purposefulness that years of experience had taught her to employ in moments of crisis. "Good heavens!" Dorothy exclaimed, appearing from the kitchen with flour-dusted hands. "Whatever can be the matter?" The answer came in the form of Clara Hartwell, running down the lane with her coat flying behind her and her face white with shock. She stumbled as she reached the garden gate, catching herself against the post while gasping for breath. "Please," she managed between sobs. "Someone must come at once. It's Aunt Rose. I found her. Oh, it's too dreadful." Miss Marple was already reaching for her coat. "Dorothy, perhaps you might telephone Dr. Pemberton and ask him to come immediately to Ivy Cottage. And the police, I think. Though let us first ascertain exactly what has occurred." The short walk to Rose Linton's cottage felt interminable, though it could not have taken more than 3 minutes. Clara led them through the front garden, past the carefully tended rose bushes that gave the cottage its name, and through the unlocked front door into the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. "In the study," Clara whispered, pointing toward a door at the rear of the cottage. "I came to bring her some fresh milk from the farm, as I always do on Thursdays. When she didn't answer, I used the spare key she gave me. The door was locked from the inside, you see, and I had to go around to the garden window." Miss Marple approached the study door with measured steps, her keen eyes already noting details that might prove significant. The door was indeed unlocked now, though Clara's explanation suggested it had been secured from within. She pushed it open gently and stepped into the room that had been Rose Linton's private sanctuary. The sight that greeted them was both dramatic and somehow intimate in its tragedy. Rose sat slumped forward at her writing desk, her head resting on her arms as if she had simply fallen asleep while working. But the overturned ink bottle beside her right hand had created a spreading stain across the desk's surface, and the scattered papers beneath her arm were blotched with black that had already begun to dry. "I touched her hand," Clara said from the doorway, unable to enter the room again. "She was quite cold. I think she must have been dead for hours." Dr. Pemberton arrived within minutes, a competent man in his 60s who had served the village faithfully since before the war. He examined Rose with professional thoroughness, while Miss Marple stood quietly nearby, her attention focused not on the body, but on the room itself. "Heart failure, I should say," the doctor pronounced after completing his examination. "She had mentioned some cardiac irregularities when she consulted me last month. The stress of working late into the evening may have precipitated an attack." "Working late?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Dr. Pemberton gestured toward the desk. Clearly she was engaged in some sort of writing project when it happened. See how she was leaning forward over her work. The exertion of concentration, particularly in someone with a weak heart, can be quite dangerous. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, careful not to disturb anything, but observing with the trained attention to detail that had served her so well in the past. The ink stain was indeed dramatic, spreading across several sheets of paper in a pattern that spoke of sudden upset. But something about the distribution troubled her slightly, though she could not immediately identify why. "Dr. Pemberton," she said carefully, "might I ask about the positioning of the ink bottle? It seems to have fallen quite far from where one would naturally place it while writing." The doctor glanced at the desk with renewed attention. "Ah, yes, I see what you mean. Though in the throes of a cardiac episode, one might well knock things about considerably. The body's response to such distress is quite unpredictable." Inspector Craddock arrived from the county seat within the hour, a methodical man who had learned to respect Miss Marple's observations during their previous encounters. He examined the scene with professional competence, asking appropriate questions about Rose's recent behavior and health. "The door was locked from the inside, you said?" he asked Clara, who nodded while dabbing at her eyes with a damp handkerchief. "Yes, I had to use the garden window to get in. Aunt Rose was very particular about security, always locked her study door when she was working on something important." "Important work?" Inspector Craddock's eyebrows rose slightly. "What sort of important work does a village librarian typically undertake?" Clara's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple noted it carefully. "Research projects, I suppose. Historical investigations for various people. She was always very thorough about such things." As the official examination of the scene continued, Miss Marple found herself drawn to a leather-bound book that lay open beside Rose's right elbow. It appeared to be a diary or journal, with entries written in Rose's neat handwriting. But something about its appearance struck her as odd. Several pages seemed to have been removed with unusual precision, leaving clean edges that suggested deliberate excision rather than accidental damage. "Inspector Craddock," she said quietly, I wonder if you might examine this journal more closely. There appear to be some pages missing." The inspector studied the diary with growing interest, his expression becoming increasingly grave as he read the remaining entries. "This is most irregular," he muttered, then looked up at Clara with new attention. "Miss Hartwell, were you aware that your aunt was keeping detailed records of various villagers' activities?" Clara's face went even paler than before. "Records? What sort of records?" Instead of answering directly, Inspector Craddock read aloud from one of the intact pages. "The pattern becomes clearer with each passing day. What I initially attributed to coincidence now appears to follow a deliberate design. The documentation I have gathered suggests that several residents of this village are not what they appear to be." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of this discovery settled upon everyone present. Miss Marple found herself studying Clara's reaction with particular care, noting the genuine shock that seemed to replace her earlier grief. "She never mentioned anything like this to me," Clara whispered. "She said she was researching local history, nothing more." Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should consider whether Miss Linton's heart condition might have been exacerbated by stress or anxiety. If she believed herself to be investigating some sort of village conspiracy, or if someone believed she was," Miss Marple added quietly, earning sharp looks from both men. Inspector Craddock spent another hour examining the cottage thoroughly, paying particular attention to the study and its contents. When he finally declared the scene complete, arrangements were made for Rose's body to be removed for a more complete medical examination. As the cottage emptied of official personnel, Miss Marple lingered for a few moments in the study doorway, her trained eye cataloguing details that might prove significant. The spilled ink, the missing diary pages, the perfectly positioned body, all seemed to tell a story, though not necessarily the simple tale of natural death that Dr. Pemberton had initially proposed. The afternoon sun slanted through the garden window, illuminating the scene with golden light that somehow made the tragedy seem even more poignant. Rose Linton had clearly been a woman who valued truth and accuracy, as evidenced by her meticulous record-keeping and careful observations. That such a person should die under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered struck Miss Marple as profoundly wrong. As she finally turned to leave the cottage, Miss Marple made a silent promise to her departed fellow observer of human nature. If Rose Linton's death was indeed the result of something more sinister than heart failure, then the truth would be uncovered, no matter how carefully it might have been concealed. Chapter 5. Pages from the Past. The news of Rose Linton's death spread through Marbury with the peculiar velocity that tragedy acquires in small communities. By evening, scarcely a household remained unaware that their quiet librarian had been found dead at her writing desk, and that the circumstances surrounding her demise were perhaps not as straightforward as they initially appeared. Inspector Craddock had established temporary headquarters in the parlour of the Lamb and Flag, the village's modest public house, where he began the methodical process of interviewing those who had known Rose best. Miss Marple, with the inspector's tacit permission, found herself present for many of these conversations, her knitting providing the perfect cover for careful observation. Mrs. Weatherby proved an invaluable source of background information, her years in the village having given her an encyclopedic knowledge of local relationships and histories. Rose was always very private, she told Inspector Craddock over tea in her sitting room. But she wasn't secretive in an unpleasant way, if you understand the distinction. Simply a woman who preferred to keep her own counsel. "When did you last speak with her?" the inspector inquired, making careful notes. 3 days ago at the parish meeting. She seemed rather preoccupied, though I attributed it to the usual committee tensions. Mrs. Selby can be quite overwhelming when she sets her mind to organizing something. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with apparent casualness. Did Rose mention any particular concerns at that meeting? Any subjects that seemed to trouble her? Dorothy considered this carefully. Now that you mention it, she did make some rather pointed comments about the value of historical research, and she seemed particularly interested when Mrs. Selby made that remark about wartime flexibility. At the time, I thought she was simply being tactful, but perhaps what? Inspector Craddock prompted. Perhaps she knew more about our local wartime history than she let on. Rose had access to all sorts of records through the library, you know, parish registers, newspaper archives, even some private papers that people donated over the years. Their next interview was with Dr. Pemberton, who confirmed his earlier assessment of Rose's cardiac condition while providing additional context that Miss Marple found illuminating. She consulted me about 6 weeks ago, the doctor explained, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed his notes. Complained of irregular heartbeat, occasional chest pains, classic symptoms of cardiac stress, particularly in a woman of her age. Did she mention any specific sources of stress or anxiety? Inspector Craddock asked. Dr. Pemberton hesitated. She did say something rather odd, actually. Asked me about the symptoms of various types of poisoning. Said she was researching a historical case for someone, but the questions were quite detailed. Digitalis in particular. She wanted to know how it might be detected post-mortem. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. Digitalis. That's derived from foxgloves, isn't it? Indeed. Quite common in cottage gardens, actually. Mrs. Selby grows magnificent specimens in her herbaceous border, but Rose's questions were more medical than botanical. The interview with Reverend Thornfield took place in the church vestry, surrounded by the musty smell of old prayer books and ceremonial vestments. The vicar appeared even more nervous than usual, his hands trembling slightly as he poured tea from a chipped china service. Miss Linton was always very helpful with historical research, he said, avoiding direct eye contact. The church records, you understand. Baptisms, marriages, burials. Sometimes people need documentation for legal purposes. What sort of legal purposes? Inspector Craddock inquired. The vicar's discomfort was palpable. Inheritance matters, mostly. Proving relationships, establishing dates of birth or death. Though recently, Rose had been asking some rather unusual questions about irregularities in the records. Irregularities. Discrepancies between different documents, baptismal records that didn't match birth certificates, that sort of thing. She seemed to think there might have been some creative record-keeping during the war years. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the vicar with gentle attention. How troubling that must have been for her, discovering such inconsistencies. Did she share her concerns with anyone? Reverend Thornfield's face flushed. She mentioned that some situations from the past might need to be clarified, but she was always very discreet. Too discreet, perhaps, for her own good. After the vicar departed, Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple remained in the vestry while the inspector reviewed his notes. The afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows cast coloured patterns across the ancient stones, creating an atmosphere of contemplative mystery. This historical research of hers seems to have been more extensive than anyone initially realized, the inspector observed. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, and rather more dangerous, one might suggest. Their next stop was Ivy Cottage itself, where Inspector Craddock had arranged to conduct a more thorough examination of Rose's personal effects. Clara Hartwell met them at the door, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her manner composed. "I've tried not to disturb anything," she said, leading them back to the study. "Though I did move the teacup to the kitchen. It seemed disrespectful to leave it there." Miss Marple paused at this information. Teacup. I don't recall seeing one during the initial examination. It was beside her elbow, nearly hidden by the scattered papers, still half full with her usual evening blend. She always had a cup of chamomile tea before bed. In the study, Inspector Craddock began a systematic search of Rose's desk drawers, while Miss Marple examined the fireplace with particular attention. Among the cold ashes, she discovered several fragments of partially burned paper, their edges charred, but some text still legible. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should see this." The fragments, when carefully pieced together, revealed portions of what appeared to be diary pages, the missing sections from Rose's journal. Most of the text was illegible, but certain words remained clear enough to read. Poison, inheritance, and what looked like Eleanor Selby. Clara gasped when she saw the fragments. But why would Aunt Rose burn parts of her own diary? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently. She didn't. The final discovery came when Inspector Craddock examined Rose's writing materials more closely. The fountain pen that lay beside her hand contained blue ink, while the stain on the desk was clearly black. More telling still, the pen's nib was clean, showing no evidence of recent use. "This is most irregular," the inspector muttered, making detailed notes of these discrepancies. Either Miss Linton changed pens immediately before her death, or someone else created the ink stain to disguise the true circumstances of her death. Miss Marple completed quietly. As evening shadows lengthened across the cottage garden, the three of them stood in Rose's study considering the implications of their discoveries. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of natural death was revealing itself to be something far more complex and disturbing. Clara broke the contemplative silence with a whispered confession. "There's something else you should know. Yesterday evening Aunt Rose telephoned me in great distress. She said she had uncovered information that would shock the entire village, and that she feared for her safety. I thought she was being overly dramatic, but now—" Miss Marple studied the young woman's face carefully, noting both grief and guilt in her expression. Rose Linton had clearly been a woman who took her responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously for her own well-being. That such dedication to truth might have cost her life struck Miss Marple as a tragedy that demanded justice, whatever the personal cost to those whose secrets had been threatened by exposure. As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple took one last look around the study where Rose had spent her final hours. The scattered papers, the suspicious ink stain, the burned diary fragments, all spoke of a story that was far from complete and of a truth that someone had been desperate to conceal. Chapter 6. Truth in Ashes. The following morning brought a change in the weather that seemed to mirror the shifting atmosphere of the investigation. Heavy clouds gathered over Marbury's coast, and a persistent drizzle began to fall, creating the sort of grey, introspective day that encouraged indoor contemplation and whispered conversations. Miss Marple made her way to the church early, ostensibly to admire the medieval architecture, but actually to speak with the elderly sexton, Mr. Bamber, who had tended the grounds for nearly 40 years and possessed the sort of institutional memory that proved invaluable in understanding village dynamics. She found him in the vestry, polishing the brass candlesticks with the methodical care of long practice. His weathered face lit up when she introduced herself as Dorothy Weatherby's guest. "Ah, yes, miss," he said, setting down his polishing cloth. "Terrible business about Miss Linton. A proper lady she was. Always very respectful when she came asking about the old records." "She consulted the church records frequently?" Miss Marple inquired, settling herself on a wooden chair near his workbench. "Oh yes, regular as clockwork for the past month or so. Very interested in the wartime entries, particularly the baptisms and marriages from 42 to 45. Asked me about some of the handwriting, Wanted to know who had made certain entries when the old vicar was ill. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Different handwriting in the official records? Mr. Bamber nodded slowly. Reverend Pembroke took ill with pneumonia in the winter of '43, couldn't perform his duties for months. Various people helped out, Mr. Thornfield, though he was just a curate then, and sometimes Mrs. Selby, being as she was head of the parish committee and had a fine hand for writing. The implications of this information settled over Miss Marple like pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align. Mrs. Selby assisted with record-keeping. Very helpful she was, too. Though between you and me, miss— Mr. Bamber lowered his voice conspiratorially. Some of those entries never did look quite right to my eye, but who was I to question the lady's work? She was doing a kindness, after all. Miss Marple spent another quarter hour with the helpful sexton before making her way through the drizzle to Geoffrey Hartwell's cottage, a modest stone dwelling that reflected its owner's preference for privacy and order. She found the retired solicitor in his study, surrounded by legal texts and newspaper clippings. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her with old-fashioned courtesy. "Dorothy mentioned you might call. Dreadful business about Rose Linton. She was a most methodical person, not the sort one would expect to suffer a sudden heart attack." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, accepting his offer of tea. "I understand she had been researching wartime legal matters recently. As a former solicitor, you might have provided valuable assistance with such inquiries." Mr. Hartwell's expression grew guarded. "She did consult me about certain procedural questions. Nothing specific, you understand, just general inquiries about how legal documents were processed during the emergency conditions of wartime." "How thoughtful of you to help. Such periods must have created numerous complications for proper legal procedures." "They did indeed." Mr. Hartwell stared out the window at the grey morning. "The authorities were often flexible about documentation when circumstances required it. People needed help, and sometimes the usual formalities had to be abbreviated." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Rose must have been researching a particularly complex case to require such detailed background information." "She was a thorough researcher, I'll grant her that. Perhaps too thorough for her own good." Mr. Hartwell's voice carried a note of regret. "She asked some rather pointed questions about inheritance procedures, particularly regarding cases where original wills might have been mislaid during air raids or other wartime disruptions. How unfortunate when important documents are lost. I suppose replacement procedures would be quite complicated." "Less complicated than one might think, actually. If witnesses could attest to a will's contents, or if a copy existed, new documents could be prepared quite legally. Though, of course, such situations required careful handling to prevent fraud." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mr. Hartwell gradually revealing more about the wartime legal irregularities that had apparently captured Rose's attention. By the time Miss Marple took her leave, she had formed a clearer picture of the complex web of emergency procedures that had governed Marbury during its most difficult years. Her next visit was to Mrs. Selby's imposing residence, where she found the widow supervising the arrangement of cut flowers in her conservatory. Mrs. Selby received her with polite formality, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension in her hostess's manner. "Such a tragedy about poor Miss Linton," Mrs. Selby said, snipping the stems of late roses with sharp precision. "Though I must say I'm not entirely surprised. The woman had been acting rather strangely recently, asking impertinent questions about matters that were none of her concern." "Impertinent questions?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Historical inquiries that seemed designed more to cause trouble than to illuminate truth. She came here last week, if you can imagine, asking about my late husband's medical treatment during his final illness. Most inappropriate, I thought." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Selby's efficient handling of the secateurs, noting the widow's familiarity with gardening tools and botanical matters. She was researching medical history? So she claimed. Wanted to know about Dr. Pemberton's wartime practice, whether he had treated many cardiac cases, what medications were available during rationing. I told her such questions were better directed to medical professionals. Yet you were able to answer some of her inquiries? Mrs. Selby's hands stilled for just a moment. One picks up medical knowledge when caring for an invalid husband, Miss Marple. Harold suffered terribly during his final months. Heart problems, difficulty breathing. I became quite expert in cardiac medications by necessity. The conversation continued as they toured Mrs. Selby's extensive gardens, where Miss Marple noted the impressive variety of plants under cultivation. The herbaceous borders contained numerous medicinal herbs, including several varieties of foxglove with their distinctive purple blooms. What beautiful specimens, Miss Marple observed, pausing before a particularly robust foxglove plant. I've always understood they're quite beneficial for heart conditions. Indeed they are, properly prepared, though of course the dosage is crucial. Too little provides no benefit, while too much can be quite dangerous. Mrs. Selby's tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple noticed the way her hands tightened on her gardening gloves. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple found herself developing a clearer understanding of the complex relationships and hidden knowledge that had shaped Rose Linton's final investigation. The librarian had clearly uncovered a network of wartime irregularities that had remained successfully concealed for years, until her systematic research had begun to reveal uncomfortable truths. The final piece of evidence came when Inspector Craddock joined Miss Marple for lunch at Dorothy's cottage, bringing with him the results of a more thorough search of Rose's belongings. We found these hidden behind the false back of her desk drawer, he said, producing a small bundle of photographs and documents. Copies of various official records, along with what appears to be correspondence from London inquiring about inheritance procedures. Miss Marple examined the materials carefully, her trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of certain details. The photographs showed various pages from official records, with particular attention paid to signatures and dates that had been altered or overwritten. She was building quite a comprehensive case, Miss Marple observed, though I suspect she may have been too trusting about her ability to handle such dangerous knowledge safely. Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. The question now is whether her death was the result of natural causes exacerbated by stress, or whether someone decided that her investigation had proceeded far enough. As the afternoon shadows lengthened despite the overcast sky, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the tragic irony of Rose Linton's situation. A woman devoted to preserving and organizing information had apparently been destroyed by the very knowledge she had worked so diligently to uncover. The truth she had sought was there, waiting to be recognized, but it would require careful analysis and perhaps considerable courage to bring it fully into the light. Chapter 7. The Weight of Knowledge. The revelation came to Miss Marple during the quiet hour before dawn, when the mind often achieves its greatest clarity. She had been lying awake in Dorothy's comfortable guest room, listening to the soft patter of rain against the windows and methodically reviewing all the details she had gathered over the past few days. It was then that the seemingly disparate pieces of information suddenly arranged themselves into a pattern so clear and terrible that she sat up in bed with a sharp intake of breath. By the time Dorothy appeared for breakfast, Miss Marple had already dressed and was sitting in the morning room with her knitting, though the wool lay untouched in her lap as she gazed thoughtfully out at the grey morning. "My dear Jane, you look as though you haven't slept a wink," Dorothy observed with concern. "I do hope the business about poor Rose hasn't upset you too greatly." "I'm afraid it has, rather, Dorothy," Miss Marple replied quietly. though perhaps not in the way you might imagine. I believe I've begun to understand what Rose discovered and why her knowledge proved so dangerous." After breakfast, Miss Marple made her way to the library, now officially closed pending the appointment of a replacement librarian. Inspector Craddock had given her permission to examine Rose's research materials more thoroughly, and she spent the morning hours piecing together the methodical investigation that had occupied the librarian's final weeks. Rose's system was beautifully organized, with cross-referenced files containing photocopied documents, detailed notes, and carefully dated observations. What emerged was the portrait of a woman who had stumbled upon inconsistencies in official records and had pursued the implications with relentless dedication to truth. The key discovery lay in a folder marked Selby Estate Matters, 1943-1944. Rose had obtained copies of multiple documents: the original will filed by Harold Selby's solicitor in London, a death certificate signed by Dr. Pemberton, and parish burial records in Mrs. Eleanor Selby's distinctive handwriting. Cross-referenced with medical records and witness statements, they told a story of careful deception spanning nearly 15 years. Miss Marple studied a particularly revealing document, a letter from Harold Selby to his London solicitor, dated just 3 weeks before his death, expressing concern about his wife's behavior and his intention to revise his will. The letter had never reached its destination, having been intercepted and preserved by someone who understood its significance. Inspector Craddock arrived as Miss Marple was examining Rose's correspondence with various official agencies in London. His expression was grave as he settled into a chair across from her makeshift workspace. "The post-mortem results have arrived," he announced without preamble. Dr. Pemberton's initial assessment was incorrect. Miss Linton died from digitalis poisoning, administered in sufficient quantity to cause immediate cardiac arrest. Miss Marple nodded without surprise. "I rather expected as much. The question now is whether we can prove how the poison was administered and by whom." "You have suspicions?" "More than suspicions, I'm afraid. Rose's research has provided us with both motive and method, though proving opportunity may require some careful investigation." She showed him the documents she had discovered, explaining how Rose had methodically uncovered evidence of Harold Selby's murder 15 years earlier. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood the significance of the various irregularities: forged signatures on the revised will, altered medical records, and convenient testimony from witnesses who had financial reasons to support Eleanor Selby's version of events. Harold Selby discovered his wife's earlier affair and intended to disinherit her, Miss Marple explained. But he died before he could execute the new will, leaving Eleanor to inherit everything. The death appeared natural, heart failure in a man with known cardiac problems, but Rose found evidence that it was carefully planned murder. Inspector Craddock studied the documentation with growing amazement. "And Mrs. Selby used the same method to silence Miss Linton?" "The same poison, certainly. Digitalis derived from her own garden, administered in a way that would appear to be natural heart failure. But this time, she made crucial errors in staging the scene." They spent the next hour analyzing Rose's final evening, reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to her death. Miss Marple's theory was both elegant and chilling in its simplicity. Mrs. Selby had visited Rose under the pretense of discussing library matters, had poisoned her evening tea, and had then attempted to destroy the evidence by burning the most incriminating diary pages. "But why stage the ink spill?" Inspector Craddock asked. "To explain why Rose was found at her desk rather than in her usual chair by the fireplace." Miss Marple replied. "Mrs. Selby needed to create the impression that Rose had been actively writing when the heart attack occurred. Unfortunately for her deception, she used the wrong pen and spilled the wrong color of ink." The inspector made careful notes as Miss Marple explained her reasoning, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of the case's complexity. It was clear that Eleanor Selby had committed 2 murders 15 years apart, using identical methods but failing to account for advances in forensic science and the persistence of a dedicated amateur investigator. "We'll need to search Mrs. Selby's residence thoroughly," Inspector Craddock said finally, looking for traces of digitalis preparation, evidence of the burned diary pages, perhaps correspondence that might have passed between her and Miss Linton. Miss Marple gathered Rose's research materials into neat piles, ensuring that nothing would be overlooked in the official investigation. "I believe you'll find what you're looking for, Inspector. Mrs. Selby is a methodical woman who keeps careful records of her activities. That trait served her well in concealing her first crime, but it may prove her downfall in the second." As they prepared to leave the library, Miss Marple paused at Rose's desk, now cleared of its tragic burden, but still bearing the faint stain where the ink had pooled. The irony was not lost on her. A woman who had devoted her life to preserving and organizing information had been killed by someone desperate to prevent that same information from becoming public knowledge. The afternoon brought the careful execution of Inspector Craddock's search warrant, conducted with the thoroughness that serious criminal investigation required. Miss Marple was not present for the actual search, but she received a detailed report of its findings that evening as she sat with Dorothy in the comfortable familiarity of the cottage sitting room. The evidence was overwhelming in its completeness: dried foxglove petals stored in a garden shed, along with detailed notes on preparation methods copied from various botanical references. More damaging still were fragments of Rose's diary pages found in the cold ashes of Mrs. Selby's drawing-room fireplace, and a draft letter in Eleanor Selby's handwriting proposing a final meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern. Most conclusive of all was the discovery of Harold Selby's intercepted correspondence, carefully preserved in a locked box that also contained forged documents, altered photographs, and detailed plans for inheriting his substantial estate. Mrs. Selby had kept meticulous records of her own crimes, perhaps as insurance against blackmail, or perhaps from an obsessive need to document her success. As evening shadows gathered over Marbury, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that had brought this case to its conclusion. Two methodical women, each dedicated to preserving truth in her own way, had found themselves in mortal conflict when their purposes diverged. Rose Linton's commitment to uncovering historical accuracy had threatened Eleanor Selby's carefully constructed fiction, leading inevitably to the confrontation that cost the librarian her life. Chapter 8. The Final Page. The gathering took place in Rose Linton's study by mutual agreement, though Miss Marple suspected that Inspector Craddock had chosen the location for its psychological impact. The morning sun streamed through the garden window, illuminating the room where truth had been pursued so diligently and where deception had ultimately claimed its victim. Mrs. Eleanor Selby arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, dressed in her customary black silk and maintaining the imperious bearing that had served her so well throughout her years of carefully constructed respectability. She acknowledged the assembled company with cool politeness. Inspector Craddock, Clara Hartwell, Dr. Pemberton, and Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner with her knitting. "I must say, Inspector, this theatrical approach seems quite unnecessary," Mrs. Selby observed, settling herself in the chair farthest from Rose's desk. "Surely a simple conversation at the station would have sufficed for whatever questions you wish to ask. I thought it appropriate that we should conclude Miss Linton's investigation in the place where she conducted it," Inspector Craddock replied with formal courtesy, "particularly since that investigation has proven so remarkably accurate in its conclusions." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the gentle smile that had disarmed so many suspects over the years. "Rose was indeed a most methodical researcher, Mrs. Selby. Rather like yourself, in fact. Both of you understood the importance of keeping careful records." A slight tightening around Mrs. Selby's eyes was the only indication that this observation had found its mark. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, but I think you do." Miss Marple's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "Rose documented everything so carefully, you see. Her investigation into your husband's death, the evidence she had gathered about the forged will, even her plans to contact the authorities in London. She kept meticulous notes, just as you kept meticulous records of your own activities." Inspector Craddock opened the file he had brought with him, revealing the substantial documentation that had been recovered from both Rose's research and Mrs. Selby's own carefully preserved papers. "We found your correspondence with Harold Selby's London solicitor, Mrs. Selby, the letter you intercepted in which your husband expressed his intention to change his will." Mrs. Selby's composure remained intact, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her gloved hands. "I'm sure I have no idea what you're referring to, Inspector." "Then perhaps you can explain these botanical notes we discovered in your garden shed?" Inspector Craddock continued, producing a folder containing Mrs. Selby's detailed research into digitalis preparation. "Quite comprehensive instructions for extracting cardiac medication from foxglove plants, far more detailed than one would expect from casual gardening interest. Many gardeners study the medicinal properties of their plants." Mrs. Selby replied, with diminishing conviction, "There's nothing suspicious in that." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Mrs. Selby with the patient attention she might give to a complex puzzle. "The difficulty, my dear, is not in the gardening research itself, but in its practical application. You used digitalis to poison your husband in 1944, making his death appear to be natural heart failure. When Rose discovered evidence of that crime, you used the same method to silence her. That's a preposterous accusation." Mrs. Selby's voice carried less authority than before. "Harold died of natural causes, as confirmed by Dr. Pemberton." Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm afraid I must correct that statement, Mrs. Selby. My examination was conducted under wartime conditions, with limited resources and considerable pressure to process cases quickly. I accepted the symptoms at face value, particularly given Harold's known cardiac problems. The digitalis you administered would have produced symptoms identical to heart failure." Miss Marple continued gently. "Particularly when given to someone with existing cardiac weakness. But Rose's research revealed the pattern, the suspicious timing of Harold's death, the convenient loss of his revised will, the testimonies from witnesses who benefited financially from your inheritance." Clara Hartwell spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Rose was frightened during our last conversation. She said someone had threatened her, warned her to stop her investigation. That someone was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Selby?" Mrs. Selby turned her cold gaze upon the young woman. "Your aunt was a foolish woman who interfered in matters that were none of her concern. Some secrets are better left buried." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "But there you made your fundamental error, my dear. Rose understood that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully one attempts to conceal it. That's why she documented everything so thoroughly, not from suspicion, but from a librarian's instinct to preserve important information." Inspector Craddock leaned forward in his chair. "We know you visited Miss Linton on the evening of her death, Mrs. Selby. You brought digitalis extract with you, dissolved it in her evening tea, and waited for the poison to take effect. You then attempted to destroy the most incriminating pages from her diary," Miss Marple added. "But you made the mistake of trying to stage an accident with the ink bottle. Unfortunately, you used black ink when Rose habitually wrote with blue, and you positioned the bottle incorrectly for the spatter pattern you created." Mrs. Selby's facade was beginning to crack, though she maintained her rigid posture. "You cannot prove any of this, circumstantial evidence and speculation." "On the contrary," Inspector Craddock said quietly, "we have quite substantial proof. The fragments of diary pages we recovered from your fireplace match the missing sections from Miss Linton's journal. Your fingerprints are on the teacup Clara mentioned. Most damaging of all, we found traces of digitalis in both your garden preparation area and on items in Miss Linton's kitchen. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantelpiece clock and Clara's barely audible weeping. Mrs. Selby sat motionless for a long moment, her composure finally cracking under the weight of irrefutable evidence. She would have destroyed everything. Mrs. Selby said at last, her voice hollow but still defiant. 15 years of careful building, of establishing myself in this community, of creating something worthwhile from Harold's money. Rose Linton would have reduced it all to ruins for the sake of her precious truth. And so you decided that her life was less important than your secret. Miss Marple observed with gentle sadness. Harold was going to leave me with nothing. Mrs. Selby continued, as if the words had been held inside too long. After years of caring for his querulous complaints, managing his household, presenting the perfect wife to his business associates, he would have cast me aside for a younger woman if I had allowed it. Inspector Craddock was taking careful notes as the confession continued, but Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Selby's face with a mixture of pity and professional interest. Here was a woman whose careful planning and methodical approach had served her well for 15 years, undone ultimately by the same traits that had made her successful. I could not allow Rose to destroy everything I had built. Mrs. Selby concluded quietly, her voice trembling for the first time. I worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it all crumble because of one woman's misguided devotion to historical accuracy. The formal arrest followed with bureaucratic efficiency, though Mrs. Selby maintained her dignity even as Inspector Craddock read the charges against her. As she was led away, she paused at the study door for one last look at the room where her victim had worked so diligently to uncover the truth. Later, after the official procedures had been completed and the cottage had emptied of its tragic burden, Miss Marple remained for a few moments in Rose's study. The afternoon light had shifted, casting different shadows across the desk where so much careful research had been conducted. Clara joined her there, having composed herself sufficiently to speak of practical arrangements. There will be a funeral service tomorrow, she said quietly. The whole village will attend, I think. They've finally realized what kind of woman my aunt truly was. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Rose devoted her life to preserving truth and organizing knowledge. In the end, even her death served that same purpose. The diary she kept, incomplete as it is, provided the final evidence needed to ensure that justice was served. As evening settled over Marbury, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that had shaped this case. Two women of similar temperament and methodical approach had found themselves on opposite sides of truth, with fatal consequences. Rose Linton's dedication to uncovering the past had cost her life, but it had also ensured that her murderer's carefully constructed lies would finally crumble under the weight of evidence. The secret diary had indeed told its story, though not in the way its author had intended. Sometimes, Miss Marple mused as she walked home through the gathering dusk, the most important truths emerge not from what is written, but from what desperate people will do to prevent the writing from being read. And so, the final page is turned. The truth revealed, the ink dry, and another secret returned to its resting place among the shelves of the hidden library. If you stayed until the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. If this mystery kept you guessing, leave a like and subscribe for more stories waiting to be discovered. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, because in the hidden library, there's always another mystery waiting to be told.